I was about 10 years old when things started to get strange in the small Texas town we lived in. It was one of those remote places you'd only ever stop in to grab a soda or use the bathroom while driving to a real city. Quiet, plain, and unremarkable. It wasn't the kind of town anyone paid much attention to, not even the people who lived there. One summer day, I found out my best friend Mason was moving. He told me during recess, his voice low like he wasn't supposed to say anything. I asked why, but he just shrugged, saying his parents had packed everything up overnight. That afternoon his family was gone, their house empty as if they'd never been there. When I got home, I asked my parents if they knew why Mason's family left. My dad muttered something about a new job out of town, but my mom's lips pressed into a thin line. She told me not to worry about it, her tone sharper than usual. I didn't understand why they seemed so tense, but over the next few weeks the same thing happened with other families. One by one, our neighbors packed up and left without any warning. Some houses stayed dark, windows boarded up, while others seemed like they were still being lived in, but I never saw anyone go in or out. When I asked my mom about it again, she told me to focus on my homework. My dad would grumble about people needing to mind their own business. Neither of them gave me real answers, and eventually I stopped asking. But I couldn't stop noticing how empty everything was getting. At school, the classrooms felt hollow. Desks that used to be full were now scattered vacant. Even my teacher, Mrs. Crawford, quit one day without any warning. A substitute came in for a week, but then there were barely enough kids to fill the class. I couldn't help but feel like I was missing something important, like the adults knew something they weren't telling us. My friends and I whispered about it during lunch. Some of them thought there was a curse, something that made people leave. Others said there was some kind of government cover-up, though none of us could agree on what that might mean. Then, just as suddenly as it started, my parents announced we were moving too. My dad told me it was because he got a better job in Houston, but I could tell that wasn't the full story. My mom wouldn't even look me in the eye when I asked why we had to leave so fast. In less than a week, our things were packed, the moving truck arrived, and we were gone. Houston was loud and bustling, a complete 180 from the sleepy town I'd known all my life. For a while, the noise and excitement distracted me from what had happened. But as I got older, I couldn't stop thinking about that place, about the way everyone seemed to vanish overnight. Whenever I asked my parents about it, they'd brush it off. My dad would crack a joke or change the subject. My mom would just sigh, saying it wasn't worth thinking about. But there was something in her eyes, like she was afraid I'd dig too deep and uncover something I wasn't supposed to know. Years later, when I was in my 20s, I decided to drive through the old town on a whim. I didn't tell anyone. I just wanted to see it for myself, to see if maybe being there again would help me understand what happened. The town looked exactly the way I remembered it, but wrong. The houses were still there, but most of them were empty shells. Paint peeled from the siding, windows were cracked or missing entirely, and the yards were overgrown with weeds. Nature had started reclaiming the place. The gas station where we used to buy candy was boarded up, and the playground at the park was rusted and broken. The swings creaked in the wind, though no one was there to push them. I drove slowly, my car the only sound in the stillness. It felt like the town was holding its breath, watching me. I wanted to get out and explore, but an unsettling feeling crept up my spine. It was the same kind of feeling you get when you're being followed, like someone, or something, was just out of sight. I didn't stay long. Something told me I wasn't supposed to. When I got back home, I tried searching online for any information about the town, but there was nothing. No news articles, no records of what happened. It was as if the place had been erased. I brought it up to my parents again, but the reaction was the same. My dad told me I was overthinking it, and my mom walked out of the room without a word. Whatever had happened there, they clearly didn't want to talk about it. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that there's something I'm missing, some piece of the puzzle that no one will give me. I don't know what drove everyone away or why no one wants to admit anything happened. But I do know this, that town wasn't normal, and whatever was wrong with it, it still lingers. Maybe one day I'll go back again. Maybe I'll find the answers I've been looking for. But deep down, I'm not sure I want to know. When I was a kid, we lived in one of those suburban neighborhoods that was far enough away from the city to be considered a small town, but close enough to also just say that you lived in the city. I have a lot of fond memories of that place, but there is one particular memory that still haunts me to this day. In the cul-de-sac, there was a weird house that looked slightly older than the rest of the homes in the neighborhood. For whatever reason, nobody ever lived there while my family was in the neighborhood. The kids all had different stories about it, but the official story was that some old lady had lived there since before the neighborhood had actually been built, and when she died, the house was just left to rot. Depending on who you asked, there was some weird story about the house. Some people would hear noises coming from the place at night. Others would actually see shadows moving in the windows. There was a game kids would play sometimes, where they would see who could get closer to the house before getting scared and running away. As for me, I was never really the brave type. I tried my best to stay away from the house at all costs. It was easy because I wasn't really an outdoors kind of kid. A good time for me was spent indoors playing video games, but it wasn't until around 6th grade when I had my encounter with the house at the end of the road. This is embarrassing, but I was very insecure at this time. I had always been a part of the geek crowd in my school and wanted to see if I could be a part of the cool kids. One of the cool kids had moved into my neighborhood, and we had spent a little bit of time playing. He suggested that we sneak out at night and investigate the house at the end of the road. Wanting him to tell all his other friends about how cool I was, I reluctantly agreed to the adventure. Sneaking out, as bad as it made me feel, was easy. We met at the designated spot and ventured to the house. When we were still in the distance, I could tell that something was wrong. It looked like there were lights coming from the window of the house, but not lights from a light bulb. It looked like there were candles lit up in there. My friend urged me to go ahead to check it out. Not wanting to look cowardly, I agreed to venture further. I remember how shaky my legs suddenly were. I had never been so terrified in my life. Looking back, it's crazy to think what lengths I was willing to go to be accepted as a cool kid, but somehow I pressed forward. I was probably about 5 feet away from the house when I saw something else in the window. There was actually someone in there. It looked like a shadowy figure, but it also could have been someone in a black robe. My first instinct was to run away, but I didn't want to be seen, so I just froze. I figured that whoever was in there couldn't be able to see me outside in the dark if I stood very still. But after an uncomfortable amount of time, they still stood there looking right back at me. My worst fears were confirmed when another robed figure appeared, and the first one said something to them and pointed right at me. And then the second one looked at me too. That was when all bets were off. I took off running as fast as my little legs could carry me. I didn't say a word to my friend. I just passed him, and he was smart enough to follow me. I could hear a door creak open behind me, but I never looked back. We just ran and ran until we couldn't run anymore. Eventually, we took cover in some bushes and waited it out. My heart stopped whenever a car would drive by. At one point, I swear we heard footsteps on the sidewalk next to us. I don't know if whoever was in that house was looking for us, or if it was just some passerby. But we weren't about to find out. Eventually, I made it home. I didn't sleep that night because I was terrified that whoever was in that house was going to find me. I had nightmares that night about looking out my window to see robed figures standing outside of my house watching me. I was very uneasy the next few days. I felt an immense pressure, like something horrible was going to happen, but nothing ever did. I never did become a part of the cool kids group. Me and that friend drifted apart sometime after we started middle school, but we never really talked about what happened, except to confirm that no one ever came looking for us. That was my first and final adventure into the unknown. I am glad that nothing ever came of it, except for looming anxiety. But sometimes I still think about that night and can't help but wonder what was going on inside of that house. I think it's better that I never found out. I always dreamed of graduating college and getting a high-paying job right off the bat that would allow me to get a big house in a bustling city and afford anything that I ever wanted. Reality hit hard when I graduated and endured a string of interviews that went nowhere. Eventually, I had to out my standards on hold and settle for just a roof over my head and 4 walls that would allow basic privacy. The only place that fell within that standard that I could afford presented itself in a random Craigslist ad that offered a single bedroom. Before you get after me about responding to a Craigslist ad, please know that I was desperate. I had exhausted all of my other options and I was running out of cash fast. I figured that I could stay in the room just until I got a better job and work a better but I had no idea what I was in for. The address led me to a very rustic-looking part of the county. I had to leave the city and drive through the middle of nowhere just to get there. The house itself barely looked like a house. It was more like a collection of battered materials that someone superglued and duct taped together. My first instinct was to hit the gas and head for the hills. But again, I was desperate. I parked in the gravel driveway, hesitating for a moment before stepping out. The air smelled damp and earthy, like the aftermath of a storm, though the sky was clear. The house was eerily quiet, not even the chirping of birds or the hum of insects breaking the stillness. I approached the front door, a warped piece of wood that looked like it had been repurposed from an old barn, and knocked. The door creaked open almost instantly, as if someone had been standing just behind it. A man in his late 40s, with sunken eyes and a wiry frame, greeted me. His name was Greg. He gave me a thin smile, but there was something about it that didn't quite reach his eyes. He said he'd been expecting me and gestured for me to come in. Inside, the house was just as dilapidated as it looked from the outside. The floors creaked with every step, and the walls were lined with mismatched wallpaper that peeled in places, exposing water-stained wood. The smell was worse inside, an odd combination of mildew and something metallic. Greg led me to the room I'd be renting, a small space with a single bed, a rickety desk, and a tiny window that looked out onto the overgrown backyard. I told myself it was only temporary. I handed over the cash for the first month and tried not to think too much about the fact that Greg didn't ask for a deposit or even a formal agreement. That first night I couldn't sleep. The mattress was lumpy, and the room was uncomfortably cold despite the warm weather outside. Around midnight I heard faint noises, creaking floorboards and what sounded like whispering. I told myself it was just Greg moving around the house or my imagination playing tricks on me in an unfamiliar place. The next morning I ran into Greg in the kitchen. He was frying something on the stove, though the smell was strange, like burnt hair. He said good morning and asked how I slept. I told him I was still getting used to the place. He chuckled, saying that most people don't stick around long enough to get used to it. I asked him what he meant, but he just shrugged and changed the subject. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. At night, I'd hear the same faint whispering, but now it was closer, almost as if it was right outside my door. Sometimes I'd wake up to the feeling of being watched, though whenever I turned on the light, the room was empty. I started noticing things in the house that didn't make sense, like how the front door was always locked with a heavy chain, even during the day, or how Greg would disappear for hours without a word, only to return covered in dirt. One night, I woke up to the sound of my door creaking open. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, the glow of the screen illuminating the dark room. The door was ajar, but there was no one there. I got up to close it, but as I reached the handle, I froze. Down the hallway, I could see a figure standing at the end. It wasn't Greg. It was taller, its limbs unnaturally long, and its head tilted at an odd angle, like it was studying me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I confronted Greg. I told him about the figure, about the noises, about how I couldn't stay there anymore. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable, and said I should probably leave if I felt that way. There was no argument, no attempt to convince me to stay. It was like he expected this. I ended up moving back in with my parents for a few months after that. Things started to look up, and I had a few promising job prospects. And then I got the most random text message. I recognized the number as Greg's. It caught me off guard because I thought that I would never hear from the guy again. But I opened the message and my heart sank into the pit of my stomach. He had sent me pictures of me while I was asleep, along with a smiley face. Fear and rage filled within me. I couldn't believe how stupid I had been to get myself into such a stupid situation. I called the police, and they agreed to pay Greg a visit. But when they got to the house, it was abandoned. They said that it was as if no one had been there in years. That description about matched what my first impression about the place was. I blocked Greg's number and never looked back. I'm thankful that nothing further ever came of the situation, but I still feel shame and anger about what happened. Today I'm still not living the fantastical dream that I set for myself in college, but I have a good paying job that allows a modest standard of living that I am happy with. And after the experience I had with Greg, it's the best outcome in the world. I wanted to share this because it's been driving me crazy by keeping it to myself. It's one of those things that doesn't even sound too bad when you talk about it out loud, but I just have to get it out. It all started a few months ago when an old couple moved into the house across the street from us. The home had been empty the whole time since I moved into my home a few years ago. In my introverted way, it felt nice to have one less awkward encounter whenever I went to my car in the morning or checked the mail. But I didn't mind. It first happened a few nights after they first moved in. A flickering light on their porch woke me up. The light is in an annoying position that shines right through the crack in my blinds in my bedroom. I don't know how long it was going off before I woke up, but it felt like the sun was in my eyes. I had that deep feeling of dread that you get whenever you wake up from a nightmare. I was almost scared to leave the covers, which was funny because I hadn't felt that since I was a child. But it was there, and I didn't even remember dreaming anything. I was annoyed, but I was also too tired to get up and do anything about it. So I just rolled over in bed and tried to fall asleep again. I forgot all about it the next day and went along with my routine, and then it happened again the next night. This time I checked the time on my phone. It was around 3:15. I had the same feeling of dread that I had experienced the night before. This time I sat up in bed and tried to remember what I had been dreaming, but like the night before, I couldn't come to any conclusions. It was just blank. I shuddered a little bit, because I still had the sense of fear that the nightmare had left me with. It was one of those feelings where any little sound in the house could put you on edge. But I decided to shake it off. This time I got up and checked the window. The neighbor's porch light was still flickering. I just watched it for a bit while a sense of irritation slowly replaced the fear I had felt. I don't know why, but I just stared at it like I was in some kind of trance. And then before long, it just stopped. I was able to fall back asleep. The next morning I thought about it for a little bit, but since I had slightly overslept, I quickly forgot about it in the hustle. And then the next night it happened again. Same feeling. Same time. Same time. Same fearing. I was able to shake the fear off faster this time because I was so annoyed. I found an extra blanket in my closet and went through the trouble of nailing it to my wall to actually cover the entire window. I wasn't going to let it happen again. The next day it was the weekend. I hadn't realized it, but I was so tired from waking up in the middle of the night all week. I slept in a bit that day. but when I went outside to leave the house later that day, I spotted the old man who had moved into the house. He gave me a warm smile and waved. I greeted him back and welcomed him to the neighborhood. It took a bit of self-control to hide my irritation at him because of the last few nights. Giving him the benefit of the doubt, I figured that he had no idea about what was happening. How could he? I wouldn't have brought it up, but he turned out to be a very chatty old man. I found myself roped into a whole conversation where he basically shared his whole life story. I was only half listening, trying to find a natural spot to mention my dilemma. Unfortunately, the opening never came, so I just needed to spit it out before he went back inside. As politely as I could, I mentioned that his porch light might have needed replacement because it kept flickering on and off through the last few nights. At this, he looked confused. He looked at me and then up to the night. He pointed at it, asking if that was the light he was talking about. I nodded, and he said that it was the only light in the whole house that didn't work. He even opened the door and flicked the switch on and off to show that it indeed wasn't working. I left that conversation feeling very confused. I knew for a fact that it was his porch light that I was seeing every night, but the evidence was there clear as day, so there was nothing more to do about it. I shrugged it off, figuring that since it was now covered up, there was nothing more to do about it. But then it happened again that night at 3:15 again. I woke up with my hand up, shielding my face from the light, except there was no light. My blanket was still tacked up in the same spot that it had been the night before. I sat there in a confused state for a long time while the sense of nightmare dread wore off. I was certain that the flickering lights had woken me up, but it was nearly pitch black in my room. Eventually I rose from the bed. I had to check because at this point I thought that I was going crazy. I lifted the blanket from the wall, and sure enough, just as it had been all the nights before, it was there. The flickering light on the porch, bright like the sun. I stared at it, almost feeling good about the whole thing, despite what the old man had said, and despite him showing me the evidence. It was all there. I almost grabbed my phone to record the whole thing so that I could show him later, but I didn't want to be that neighbor. The old man had been gracious enough to show me that the light wasn't working. He wasn't in on it. This was personal, between me and the light itself. Things continued like that for a while. I'd wake up at the same time, feeling the same sense of dread. No matter what I did, the flickers of the light always woke me up. I put a thicker blanket on the wall. I put multiple blankets on the wall. In a crazed state, I even bought slabs of drywall to cover the window altogether, but nothing ever worked. It wasn't until I fell asleep on the couch watching TV one night when I finally slept through the entire night, but I wasn't happy about that. I wanted to sleep in my own bed, in my own room, and I wasn't going to leave my home. This was my home. It was my room. The flickers weren't going to drive me away, so in protest and extreme stubbornness, I continued to sleep in my own room. The flickering continued to wake me up, and the dread of the forgotten nightmares continued to plague me. Every night they seemed to last just a little bit longer. Eventually, I memorized the pattern of the flicker. Sometimes I'd even wake up a bit before they started. It became a part of my routine. It became a part of my life. I tried to live with it for some time. But the change in my sleep cycle affected my life little by little. I became more irritable. I became more paranoid. Every time I saw a flicker of light somewhere, it took everything in me not to jump. The flickers were starting to control me. They were starting to ruin me. I grew cold that year. Everything I loved about my home, my job, my life in that city all started to fade away. Slowly, I started to hate it all. I started to hate it all so much, in fact, that I jumped at the opportunity when a new position opened up in my company that would require me to move cities. I was the most focused I had ever been that week. But I made sure to nail the interview. I moved away within the week. And just like that, the flickering stopped. I started remembering my dreams again, though I'd still dream about those stupid flickers, but they didn't wake me up anymore. I had to adjust to a new life in a new place. And even though the flickers won and I had to give everything up, I still felt like I had gotten my life back. I decided not to sell that house. I haven't rented it out yet either. I don't want anyone in there. I don't want those flickers bothering anyone else. It seems petty, but it's the only way that I feel any sense of victory. Like if I deny the flickers from affecting anyone else, I can starve them, or something like that. I don't know. It's a burden on my finances, but it's the best I can do. It's the only way that I can feel power against the force that ruined one whole year of my life. I don't know what those flickers were. I don't know where they came from or what they wanted. But while I have anything to say about it, they're not going to hurt anyone else ever again.